Thank you for being here today. I want to tell you something that most people don't want to hear, because most people would rather feel good than know the truth. And I've learned over my 50 years in markets that telling people what they need to hear, rather than what they want to hear, is rarely popular, but it's always necessary. If you're watching this and you feel secure about your retirement, I need you to question that feeling. Not because I want to frighten you, but because that feeling of security might be the most dangerous thing you possess right now. You see, I've spent my entire career studying economic history, going back 500 years, studying the rise and fall of empires, the mechanics of debt cycles, the patterns that repeat across centuries. And what I'm seeing today, what's about to happen in the next 48 hours, follows a template I've seen play out dozens of times throughout history. I see the economy as a machine, not a mysterious force, not something controlled by shadowy figures in back rooms, but a machine made of simple parts called transactions. Every transaction involves someone spending money, and that spending becomes someone else's income. One person's spending is another person's income. When you understand this simple mechanic, you can begin to predict what the machine will do. And right now, that machine is about to undergo a mechanical shift. Not a crash in the traditional sense, but something more subtle and in many ways more dangerous. In my 50-plus years of studying economic history, I've learned that crises don't come from one thing. They never come from a single cause. They come from what I call convergences, multiple forces hitting at the same time, creating a cascade that overwhelms the system's ability to adapt. And I see 4 forces converging right now on American retirees. The first force is the debt cycle peak. The United States national debt has reached $38.4 trillion. Let me say that again because I don't think people fully grasp what that number means. $38.4 trillion. That's $112,000 for every man, woman, and child in America. That's $284,000 per household. And the interest payments on that debt have now exceeded $1 trillion per year. $1 trillion annually just to service the interest. Not to pay down the principal, just to pay the interest. That's more than we spend on Medicare, more than we spend on national defense. And that number is growing every single day at a rate of $6 billion per day, $255 million per hour, $70,000 per second. The second force is the demographic squeeze. 75 million Americans now receive Social Security benefits. The baby boom generation is retiring at a rate of 10,000 people per day, and they're living longer than any generation before them. Healthcare costs are rising at 8 to 10% annually, while the workforce supporting these retirees is shrinking relative to the retired population. This is not a political issue, this is arithmetic. The third force is the inflation-income mismatch. The Social Security Administration announced a 2.8% cost of living adjustment for 2026. That sounds like a raise, doesn't it? The average retiree receiving $2,015 per month will get about $56 more. But the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services announced that Medicare Part B premiums will jump to $202.90 per month, an increase of $17.90. That's a 9.7% increase, nearly 10%, while your income only rises 2.8%. Healthcare inflation is running at 8%. Your income adjustment is designed around a 2 to 3% general inflation number. Do you see the squeeze? Your costs are rising 3 to 4 times faster than your income. The fourth force is the policy trap. The government is now spending more on interest payments than on Medicare or defense. They must either print more money to service the debt, which causes inflation and erodes your purchasing power, or they must cut spending and raise taxes, which directly hurts retirees. There is no path that doesn't cause pain to those on fixed incomes. The government is trapped, and when the government is trapped, the people pay the price. On January 1st, 2026, in exactly 48 hours, the new Medicare premiums take effect. The new Social Security payments begin, and millions of Americans will discover that their raise has already been spent before they ever see a dime of it. This isn't a prediction, this is arithmetic. But here's what almost no one is talking about. The real danger isn't the premium increase itself. It's what happens after, the cascade effect that transfers wealth from the patient to the system, from those who don't understand the machine to those who do. I'll explain exactly how that transfer works. But first, you need to understand how we got here because this has happened before. And if you understand the template, you can navigate it. If you don't, you'll be swept away. Let me tell you about the most painful lesson I ever learned. In 1982, I was absolutely certain the United States economy was heading into a depression. Mexico had just defaulted on its debt. The Federal Reserve under Paul Volcker had tightened aggressively, raising interest rates to nearly 20% to break inflation. I saw all the signs I'd read about in history books. I studied the Great Depression, the debt defaults of the 1930s, and I saw the same patterns emerging. I was so sure of my analysis that I testified before Congress. I went on television. I told everyone who would listen that we were about to experience an economic catastrophe. I wrote papers, I gave speeches, I bet everything I had on this view. I was utterly, completely, devastatingly wrong. The stock market didn't crash. It began one of the greatest bull runs in history, an 18-year expansion that saw the American economy experience its longest period of non-inflationary growth ever recorded. And I lost everything. I had to borrow $4,000 from my father just to pay my family's bills. I had to fire every employee at Bridgewater. The company I had built was reduced to just one person, me, sitting alone in a room trying to figure out what went wrong. That failure nearly destroyed me financially, but it gave me something more valuable than any success ever could. It gave me humility. I realized that I needed to change my approach fundamentally. I needed to shift my mindset from thinking I'm right to asking myself, how do I know I'm right? I needed to stress test my ideas against people who disagreed with me. I needed to find the smartest people I could find who saw things differently and understand their reasoning. And I discovered something that transformed everything I do. I discovered what I call the holy grail of investing. I found that if you can assemble 15 to 20 good, uncorrelated return streams, you can reduce your risk by about 80% without reducing your expected return. Diversification across truly uncorrelated assets is the closest thing to a free lunch in investing. But it only works if you understand what environments those assets perform well in. After that failure, I devoted myself to studying every debt crisis in history. Not just 2008 or 1929, I went back 500 years. I studied the Dutch Empire and how it rose and fell. I studied the British Empire and how the pound lost its status as the world's reserve currency. I studied Rome and how they debased their currency to pay for military expansion. I studied Weimar Germany and how hyperinflation destroyed the savings of an entire generation. And I discovered something remarkable. They all follow the same template, the same mechanical progression. The technology changes, the names change. The specific circumstances differ, but the pattern is eternal because it's driven by human nature, and human nature doesn't change. People borrow too much when times are good. They extend credit too freely when asset prices are rising. They believe that this time is different. And then reality catches up and the cycle reverses. Now, most people understand what I call the short-term debt cycle. This lasts about 5 to 8 years. Interest rates rise, borrowing becomes expensive, spending falls, recession follows. Then the central bank lowers rates, borrowing becomes cheap again, spending rises, expansion follows. This cycle has happened repeatedly throughout your lifetime. You've lived through several of these cycles, but underneath these short-term cycles, there's a bigger wave that most people don't see because it takes 75 to 100 years to complete. I call this the long-term debt cycle. Here's how it works. Each short-term cycle ends with a bit more debt than the one before. Each peak is higher. Each trough is higher. The overall debt burden grows steadily over decades. And because each cycle adds more debt, eventually the debt burden becomes so large that even at low interest rates, it becomes difficult to service. That's where we are now, not in a short-term recession that will recover in a year or two. We are at the end of a long-term debt cycle that began after World War II. The debt-to-GDP ratio in the United States has reached 100%. We haven't seen levels like this since 1945 when we were fighting a world war. Interest payments are consuming nearly 20% of all federal revenue. The machine is straining under a weight it cannot sustain indefinitely. Every great empire follows the same arc. They rise on productivity and innovation. They peak on credit and leverage, and they decline when the debt burden exceeds their ability to service it. When I look at the United States today, $38 trillion in debt, $1 trillion in annual interest payments, 100% debt to GDP. I see the late stage of this cycle. I'm not saying America will fall. That's not my prediction. I'm saying the paradigm is shifting. What worked for the last 40 years will not work for the next 10. The rules are changing, and those who don't adapt will suffer. There's a concept in economics called the money illusion. It's the tendency to think in nominal terms, the number on your statement, rather than real terms, what that number can actually buy. This illusion is about to cost millions of retirees their financial security because they're being told they got a raise when in real terms, they're falling behind. Let me show you exactly how the machine works in 2026 with specific numbers. On the income side, Social Security announced a 2.8% cost of living adjustment. For the average retiree receiving $2,015 per month, that translates to about $56 more per month. That sounds positive. It sounds like progress. Your statement will show a bigger number. But let's look at the cost side. Medicare Part B premiums are jumping to $202.90. That's up $17.90 from last year. This is the first time in history that the Part B premium has exceeded $200 per month. The Part B annual deductible is rising to $283, up $26, a 10% increase. The Part A hospital deductible is now $1,736, up $60. And if you have higher income, you may face IRMA surcharges that push your Part B premium anywhere from $284 to nearly $700 per month. Now let's do the arithmetic. Your $56 raise, $17.90 goes immediately to Medicare premiums. That's 32% of your increase gone before you see a dime. After all, healthcare increases are accounted for. Your effective cost of living adjustment is closer to 1.9%. But actual inflation is running at 3% or higher. That means you're falling behind by more than 1% per year in purchasing power. This is not a raise. This is slow-motion erosion disguised as progress. Here's what makes this mechanical and inescapable. Healthcare costs for seniors are rising at 8 to 10% annually. Your income adjustment is designed around a general inflation measure that doesn't reflect what seniors actually spend money on. The Consumer Price Index for urban wage earners, which determines your COLA, includes things like televisions and computers that are falling in price. But seniors spend disproportionately on healthcare, which is rising at 3 to 4 times the general rate. This isn't a mistake in the system. This is how the system transfers wealth. You get a nominal increase that feels like progress while your real purchasing power declines year after year. Over 10 years at this rate, a retiree loses 10 to 15% of their real income. That's the difference between independence and dependence. That's the difference between staying in your home and being forced to sell it. That's the difference between dignity and desperation. And it happens so gradually that most people don't realize what's happening until it's too late. I've seen squeezes before in my studies of history, but this one is different because of the debt. The government is spending $1 trillion per year just on interest payments. Where does that trillion come from? It comes from 3 possible sources. They can print more money, which causes inflation and erodes your purchasing power. They can raise taxes, which takes money directly from your pocket. Or they can cut spending on programs you depend on. All 3 options hurt retirees. There is no path out of this that doesn't involve pain for those on fixed incomes. The government is trapped in what I call the late-stage debt trap. They cannot meaningfully increase Social Security benefits without adding to the debt. They cannot reduce the debt without cutting benefits or raising taxes. They cannot raise interest rates to attract bond buyers without increasing the already crushing interest burden. And they cannot lower rates without reigniting inflation. Every door leads to the same room, a room where the value of your savings is at risk. For 40 years, the paradigm was simple. Work hard, save money, put it in bonds or a savings account, live off the interest. Cash was safe, bonds were safe. This was the conventional wisdom that guided an entire generation of retirement planning. That paradigm is ending. In a world where the government must inflate away its debt, holding cash is holding a melting ice cube. I said cash is trash back in 2020, and people criticized me. They said I was being extreme. But look at what's happened since then. The purchasing power of the dollar has fallen 15 to 20%. The people who thought they were being conservative by holding cash and long-term bonds have lost more real wealth than many of those who took calculated risks. At the same time, financial assets, stocks, and bonds have been inflated by decades of easy money. Valuations are stretched by historical standards. So retirees are caught in a vice. Cash loses value to inflation, and financial assets are overvalued and vulnerable to correction. This is the squeeze I'm talking about. It's mechanical, it's predictable, based on the fundamentals. And it's happening right now, not in some distant future, but starting January 1st, 2026. Now here's the mechanical reality that determines everything. The Federal Reserve and the government face what I call the central bank's impossible choice. Imagine two doors. Behind door one, they stop printing money and stop raising the debt. If they do this, interest rates rise because there's less demand for bonds. Asset prices fall because money becomes more expensive. We get a deflationary bust. Unemployment spikes. Retirees' portfolios crash. This is the 1930s template, the Great Depression scenario. Behind door two, they keep printing money to service the debt and prop up the economy. If they do this, the currency loses value relative to real goods and services. Inflation stays elevated or accelerates. Your purchasing power erodes year after year. This is the 1970s template. Stagflation, or in extreme cases, the Weimar Germany template where a wheelbarrow of money couldn't buy a loaf of bread. Either way, the value of your savings is at risk. The only question is how you lose, through deflation or inflation. And I can tell you which door they will choose because I've studied this across centuries of history. Central banks always choose inflation over depression, always, because deflation is politically unsurvivable. A central banker or politician who presides over 25% unemployment and breadlines will be removed from office and remembered as a villain. A central banker who presides over 5 to 7% inflation for a decade will be criticized but will keep their job, and most people won't even fully understand what happened to them. That tells you where we're headed: managed inflation that slowly, steadily erodes the purchasing power of every fixed-income household in America. Not a crash that makes headlines, but a gradual squeeze that happens one Medicare premium increase at a time, one COLA adjustment that doesn't quite keep pace, one prescription drug that costs a little more each year. In my framework, I've categorized deleveragings into three types. The first is what I call a beautiful deleveraging. This is when policymakers get the balance right. They restructure some debts, they impose some austerity, and they print some money, but in the right proportions. Nominal growth stays above interest rates. The debt burden gradually falls as a percentage of GDP. It's painful but manageable. The United States achieved something like this after World War II. The second type is an ugly deflationary deleveraging. This is when there's too much austerity and not enough money printing. Prices fall, but debts stay fixed in nominal terms, so the real burden actually increases. Bankruptcies cascade, banks fail, unemployment soars. This is what happened in the 1930s. This is depression. The third type is an ugly inflationary deleveraging. This is when there's too much money printing relative to real economic output. The currency loses value rapidly. Savings are wiped out. Social order can break down. This is what happened in Weimar Germany, in Zimbabwe, in Venezuela. Right now, we are somewhere between a beautiful deleveraging and an ugly inflationary one. The Federal Reserve is trying to thread the needle, but the needle keeps getting smaller as the debt burden grows. And the bias, as I said, is always toward inflation, because the alternative is too politically painful. So when January 1st arrives, here's what happens mechanically, step by step. Step 1, 75 million Americans see their new Social Security payment 2.8% higher in nominal terms. They feel like they got a raise. Step 2, that same day, Medicare premiums of $202.90 are deducted 10% higher than last year. Step 3, real disposable income for retirees actually falls despite the apparent raise. Step 4, retirees cut discretionary spending to make ends meet. They eat out less, they buy fewer gifts for grandchildren, they delay purchases they don't absolutely need. Step 5, that spending cut reduces income for businesses that serve retirees. Restaurants, retailers, service providers in retirement communities. Step 6, those businesses cut back on hours, on staff, on inventory, reducing employment and tax revenue in local economies. Step 7, reduce tax revenue forces local and state governments to either raise taxes or cut services, and forces the federal government to borrow more, adding to the debt. Step 8, more debt means more interest payments, requiring more money creation to service. Step 9, more money creation relative to goods and services means more inflation, requiring higher healthcare costs. Step 10, higher healthcare costs require higher Medicare premiums, and the cycle accelerates. This is why I call it a cascade. One person's spending is another person's income. When retirees spend less, the businesses that serve them earn less. When those businesses earn less, their employees earn less. When those employees earn less, they spend less. And so on through the economy. The squeeze on retirees doesn't stay contained to retirees. It ripples through the entire economic machine. I've heard this time is different in every cycle I've lived through. The tech bubble, they said the internet had changed the rules of valuation. The housing bubble, they said real estate always goes up. Today's debt bubble, they say the United States can borrow indefinitely because we print the world's reserve currency. It's never different. The names change, the assets change, the rationalizations change. But the fundamental dynamic is always the same. Debt grows until it can't grow anymore, and then it either defaults or inflates away. The United States has a unique advantage in that we can print the world's reserve currency, which means we can inflate our way out rather than default. But inflate our way out has a cost, and that cost is paid by savers, by retirees, by those on fixed incomes. It's a transfer of wealth from creditors to debtors, from the old to the young, from those who saved to those who borrowed. I watch many indicators in my work, but one tells me more than any other about where we are in the cycle. I call it delinquency velocity, being the rate at which people start falling behind on their payments. It's not just the level of delinquencies that matters, but the acceleration, how fast that level is changing. Auto loan delinquencies are at their highest level in over a decade. Credit card defaults are accelerating faster than at any point since 2009. And here's what's most significant. The fastest growing delinquency segment is Americans over 60. When seniors start defaulting, when people who have spent their whole lives paying their bills on time start falling behind, it means the system is under real stress. It means retirement income can no longer keep up with the cost of living. That's the canary in the coal mine. And the canary is already showing signs of distress. Let me be very clear about what's happening. This isn't a crash in the dramatic sense. It's a transfer. Wealth doesn't disappear, it changes hands. When retirees are forced to sell assets at distressed prices to pay for health care or stay in their homes, someone buys those assets. Hedge funds, private equity firms, institutional investors with cash, they're waiting. They understand the mechanics. They know that when the squeeze gets tight enough, assets will be available at discounts. The crash isn't coming as a single dramatic event. For millions of retirees, the crash started years ago. One premium increase at a time, one COLA that didn't quite keep pace, one unexpected medical bill that depleted the emergency fund. It's happening in slow motion, invisible unless you know how to see it. After my failure in 1982, I learned something that saved my career and ultimately my wealth. You cannot predict the future with certainty, no matter how much you study, no matter how sophisticated your models. But you can prepare for multiple scenarios. I developed what I call the all-weather approach, a portfolio designed to perform reasonably well in any economic environment, whether we get growth or recession, inflation or deflation. The key insight is diversification across environments, not just across assets. Owning stocks and bonds is not true diversification if both of them do poorly in the same environment. You need assets that will protect you when stocks fall, assets that will protect you when inflation rises, assets that will protect you when deflation hits, and you need to understand which assets do well in which environments. Let me share 5 principles that I believe every retiree should understand and apply as we enter this new paradigm. Principle 1, ignore the nominal and watch the real. Stop looking at the number on your statement and start asking, what can this number buy? If your portfolio grows 5%, but inflation is 6%, you got poorer, not richer. If it grows 3% and inflation is 2%, you got richer. Real returns, returns after inflation, are the only returns that matter for your actual standard of living. Train yourself to think in real terms, not nominal terms. Principle 2, Don't trust the safe paradigm from the last 40 years. For 4 decades, bonds and cash were considered safe. That paradigm is ending. In an inflationary deleveraging, the safest feeling assets are often the most dangerous. Long-term bonds lock in low interest rates while inflation erodes their purchasing power. Cash earns almost nothing while losing value every day. You need assets that protect purchasing power in an inflationary environment, things like Treasury inflation-protected securities, commodities, real assets that rise with inflation rather than being destroyed by it. Principle 3. Own what the world must have. In my investing, I focus on businesses that produce essential goods and services, things people cannot stop buying no matter what happens to the economy. Utilities, railroads, food producers, healthcare companies. These businesses survive every cycle because they solve fundamental human needs, not discretionary wants. When you're allocating your savings, ask yourself, will people still need this if the economy gets bad? Own what people must have, not what they merely want. Principle 4. Hold liquidity but not cash. Liquidity is power in a crisis. In 2008, I had cash available when everyone else was panicking, and that allowed me to buy great assets at fire sale prices. You need the ability to survive 12 to 18 months without selling your core holdings at distressed prices. But holding traditional cash in an inflationary environment destroys wealth over time. Instead, consider short-term Treasury inflation-protected securities, gold, assets that are liquid, but also provide some protection against currency devaluation. You need dry powder that doesn't evaporate. Principle 5. Simplify and understand. If you cannot explain every asset you own in one sentence, you don't truly understand it. And if you don't understand it, you should probably sell it. Complex products kill in crises. Structured notes, leveraged funds, exotic derivatives, these are typically designed to profit the seller, not the buyer. When markets turn, complexity becomes opacity, and opacity becomes loss. Simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. Own things you understand, that you can explain to your grandchildren, that you know why they should hold value. The hardest part of navigating a paradigm shift isn't the mechanics, it's the mindset. Most people make decisions based on what worked in the recent past. They extrapolate forward from their experience. But in a paradigm shift, what worked becomes what fails. The strategies that built wealth in the last 40 years may destroy wealth in the next 10. You must think forward, not backward. Ask yourself, what environment are we entering? Not what environment did we just leave? The people who will thrive are those who can let go of what used to work and embrace what will work going forward, even when that feels uncomfortable, even when it contradicts everything they learned from their parents and their financial advisors. I believe that pain plus reflection equals progress. The pain of losing in 1982 forced me to reflect deeply on my assumptions and my methods. That reflection transformed my approach to everything. It led me to the principles that have guided Bridgewater for 40 years. The squeeze that's coming will be painful for millions of retirees, but those who reflect, who understand the mechanics, who see the machine clearly, can turn that pain into preparation. They can position themselves not as victims of the transfer, but as survivors who maintain their purchasing power and their dignity. Evolution is the only constant in economics as in nature. The species that survive are not the strongest or the fastest, they are the most adaptable. The retirees who will thrive in the coming decade will not be those with the most money. They will be those who adapt most quickly to the new paradigm. I'm not here to frighten you, I'm here to prepare you. The machine is doing what machines do. The cycle is ending as cycles end. The transfer is happening as transfers have happened throughout history. You cannot change the machine. You cannot stop the cycle. But you can change your position within it. You can understand the mechanics and position yourself accordingly. You can be among those who see clearly rather than those who are swept along by forces they don't understand. In 48 hours, the new paradigm becomes real in the paychecks and the premium payments of 75 million Americans. The question is not whether the squeeze will happen. The question is whether you will be positioned for the old world that is ending or the new world that is beginning. Pain plus reflection equals progress. The time for reflection is now, before the pain arrives. I hope this has been helpful to you. Thank you.